Morning, everyone. This should be Walk and Talk number 7. Came up with the idea while I was talking to someone the other day, and they were developing some products for pet food. They were realizing that there's a lot of steps with that. They were being successful in everything they were doing, so that part is great. But it made me think about all the different steps that most people have to go through to develop a product. I'm going to go ahead and grab a handful of different product types and lay out some of the steps that are necessary to get from concept to people paying you money to a successful, profitable business. What I did is I went ahead and looked up what all these different items would be. I made myself a cheat sheet because it's a long list. Most of them come naturally when you've been doing this forever. So actually putting this into a list makes sense for as you're getting started. These are things you may not have thought about or you don't understand the complexity of. Not that you can't figure it out, but it's good to know this ahead of time because it's going to make your path that much easier. I'm going to go ahead and start now with number 1. I think there's 70 or something on the list. Uh, Number 1, market research. That's going to be, who is this for? We're just going to keep, for pet food, we'll keep this something simple like dogs, cats. Good enough. There's your starting point. Are you focused on dogs? Are you focused on cats? Are you focused on dogs and cats and have a general brand that does similar things for each one? Are you looking for something that's going to be adopted, lower cost, or are you looking for something that's going to be a premium option and it's going to be a higher cost? That's the first thing to even start looking at is exactly what's the pet? Is it a general sort of thing? And then on top of it, where does your price point fall? And that's going to start looking into the demographic or psychographic of the individual that you are marketing towards on whether this particular product is something that they want. After target audience, then there'd be nutritional requirements. This is something you'll need to research and figure out because if you're looking for cats or dogs or French bulldogs versus pit bulls versus Yorkies, I don't know off the top of my head, but there may be nutritional differences between the different breeds of dogs, possibly cats too. Something to research ahead of time. Again, going back to your original market research, what's your target audience? Is it high end? Is it low end commodity? Does it get down into specific nutrition sets for different breeds of animals? And these different breeds of animals tend to be owned by different types of people. I'm not sure if the same person that gets a pit bull is the same person that gets a chihuahua. I'm sure it exists, but they may be different people. Ingredient sourcing. Now, I'm going to go on the assumption that this is not going to be something that the average person who's starting off with an idea is going to make either in their home or in a commercial kitchen. I'm going to assume that you're going to go with a co-packer or some sort of pet food product manufacturer, again, as opposed to completely making up your own recipes from scratch and then manually creating them, fabricating them, processing them, and all that. We'll go with the assumption that you are going to have help on your journey to get there. When we get back to ingredient sourcing, the thing that you have to think about is okay, so we're going to be talking with some different pet food manufacturers. Well, where are they sourcing their food from? Okay, ingredient sourcing. So you're working with a pet food manufacturer. Where are they located? Are they in California? Are they in Texas? Are they in New York? Are they in Florida? Where and also where are they getting their particular products from? What certifications are they doing to make sure that they're getting products that are of high quality? We had issues years ago where people that were getting stuff sourced out of China were getting melamine, which is a chemical that was put into a lot of the pet foods, and it killed a lot of pets. There there are more regulations now than there were before, but it's something to pay attention to and make sure that wherever you're getting your products from, they are also following the rules. After the ingredient sourcing, there's ingredient quality. You can get a collagen, and maybe one set of collagen is from one particular source and another one's cheaper, and that one isn't as good. But what is good? This is something you'll have to research and figure out. How do you judge the quality of the ingredients that you're sourcing, and how do you verify that it meets your standards, which eventually is going to be the standards of the customer that you are selling to? Regulatory requirements. Again, this goes back to very similar sort of situation where what are the requirements for different food types? There may be a certain set of ingredient or a set of regulations that go into grain ingredients, and it might be something different for a meat type ingredient. FDA guidelines and AAFCO standards. This goes into food preparation and food safety. Most likely, if you're working with a commercial pet food manufacturer, they are going to be following these rules. However, it's a good due diligence for you to read these regulations, understand what they mean, and then verify by speaking with the manufacturer that they're actually following all these, because you may find some that are awesome and some that are they say they do, and then depending on where you're sourcing from, there may be ones where they're not following it at all. And it's just good to at least open the conversation with them and figure out how well are these people producing this particular food. It's just a good idea to talk with the manufacturers and see how well they are following all these different rules and how seriously they take it. Product formulation. With a lot of co-packers, you can go in and get something that is off the shelf, what they already make, and they'll just white label it for you, which basically means you take their formulation and you put your brand and your name on it. And then that's going to be the least expensive, because what they're doing is they're making a production of X, whatever it is, and then they just switch out the packaging and add your packaging to it, and there you go. The challenge with that is their formulation may not meet all the needs that you think it should have. Number two, it's going to be the same as other white labels, potentially, as well as other competitors might come out with a similar or identical product because it's literally sourced from the same place. And you'll see this with like so with the product formulation, again, it's going to be a fixed set of ingredients and processes that the manufacturer has. And then if you want to change it, then you have a what's called a custom formulation. Now, when you start getting into the world of custom formulations, then things start getting complex, expensive, and then you also have to deal with IP concerns. When it is the formulation of the co-packer, then they're making it, it's their formula, and then the downside to that is you don't really know what the ingredients are. I mean, you kind of what they are, but again, let's say that there's some sort of grainy ingredient in the food. If they switch from this source A to this source B, they don't necessarily have to tell you, because again, let's just call it corn. They're putting corn in this particular thing, and they're going to switch from corn source A to corn source B. Still corn, percentage is the same, everything like that, but they've switched it. If you have a custom formulation versus the generic one, then you might call out this particular supplier for this particular grain. And if it's not available, then you'd have to have a secondary supply for it, or you don't do the run, because now you can't make the formulation that you want. The other thing, when you're dealing with a particular co-packer, if you're using their formulation, then let's say something happens and you're not happy with something that they did, and you decide to leave and go somewhere else. Well, that formulation is owned by the co-packer. So if you like the formulation, you just didn't like how the co-packer worked, then when you go somewhere else, you might have to develop a new custom one to try to find what the other people were doing, because they're not going to give you that information. When you're dealing with a custom formulation, depending on the place and the complexity, you're going to pay thousands of dollars potentially for your own custom formulation. And then there's different levels on that as well, where you can get a custom formulation but they still own the IP. Or you can get a custom formulation and then you get to own the IP. And then if you leave, you get to take it with you with all the ingredients, the process, everything like that. As you go up these different steps, it's going to cost more and more. So these are all things to consider when looking into starting a pet food product. Testing for nutritional balance. This goes back with the knowledge that the co-packer has. What's their background? Do they have veterinary nutritionists that are testing their own formulations? Where they're getting their information from? So it's something that you need to test. And then again, if we're doing a custom formulation or you're targeting a specific breed, let's say a dog breed, and again, what works for German Shepherds and then Chihuahuas and Pit Bulls might be different. And if you're targeting for this particular um, breed of dog, maybe they need higher collagen because their hips have problems, whereas another one is not a concern. Or they have different issues because of the shape of their skull and how their eyes are fitting in their head, and they have tear duct problems. Just putting out some of these different things that could be unique between the different breeds that might have a nutritional component if you're making a food targeting towards a specific breed. Palatability testing. There you go. So if the dog won't eat it, then that's going to be another problem. Whatever formulation you go with, based off of whatever nutrition, based off of whatever breed, based off of whatever customer you're targeting, will the dog eat it? If they're given multiple different options of off the shelf stuff, and let's go kind of Alpo, what we consider kind of bottom shelf sort of product, if they're given that versus yours, will they go for yours? What are the factors that make this palatable to the dog? Is it a fat content? Is there a salt component? How fresh can this be? And then we get into the discussion of dry ingredients versus wet ingredients. Is this canned? Is this canned but using a pouch? Is this in a kibble? Do you do big kibble, little kibble? How hard is the kibble? All these different things go into that. It's something to pay attention to and see if you can actually get tested. If you have one of the dogs that you are targeting, you can go to the grocery store and buy 3 or 4 different types of food and then see which ones they like better. And that could be an easy test for you to do. But it's something, regardless, you're going to need to do because you don't want to get all the way down the path and spend thousands of dollars and then find out that you've done something to where it's not that palatable, or you're dealing with the manufacturer that you went with, their food really isn't that appealing to dogs. They might have been making it forever, or it's inexpensive or whatever. And if a dog is given no choice, it might eat it. But what is what is going to be something that that dog is going to want to eat over and over again? And that's something you definitely want to have tested and discuss that with the manufacturer to make sure that they are doing their testing, and then also try to learn what ingredients are more palatable while still being nutritious to the animal. Next is going to be shelf life testing. Again, this goes back and forth with, are we talking about wet food, dry food? There's also refrigerated and frozen. I'm not going to go down that path because cold chain is a whole nother set of details. We will stick with shelf stable as you would be able to sell on Amazon. But so shelf life. So if we have a canned product or a canned product in a pouch, those can be easily 2 years, possibly more. If you're dealing with a kibble product, then that's going to be at least a year, I would think. But you have to look at how long does this last? What's the fat content? What's the moisture content? What are all these other kind of ingredients that are going to affect the shelf stability of the product? I would recommend that if it's not shelf stable for at least a year, that you should keep looking for another co-packer until you can find something to where you have that. Because very frequently, when it comes to logistics, shipping, if potentially you're going to go to the grocery stores or if you're just going to stick with e-com, you're going to be moving products around and it might take some time before you get enough traction in your sales that you're able to take your initial runs and actually sell through them. So you're going to want something that's going to be shelf stable at least a year. If you could do 18 months, even better. And it's just something good to ask. And then that goes into the next one, which is going to be packaging materials. We know the canned dog food, the big classic can like of Alpo, but it can also go into a pouch where the canning process is about the same, but it's a lot lighter weight versus a can. And cans don't get damaged too much, but they can get damaged, so they're a little bit less fragile than cans. So it's something else to think about. And then on the flip side, if you're doing with kibble, what kind of packaging materials? Obviously, it's going to be a bag or a pouch of some sort. How much are you going to sell this in? Again, Chihuahua versus St. Bernard. 50-pound bag lasting a couple of weeks or 20-pound bag lasting 3 months. Who are you targeting? And then also, what's your price point for that particular item? How do you know what the sellable unit is? And that's something to think about based off of the animal that you're targeting, the person that you're targeting, on what makes sense. So next we have labeling requirements. Depending on, again, wet, dry, kibble, moist, you might have to put all these ingredients on the packaging. How deep into that do you need to go? Fortunately, if you're working with a manufacturer that's already doing this, they probably know what most of these are, but it's a good thing to double check. And if they'll let you know some of the other people they're producing, because they may not, but if they do, then go and look to see how their packaging was done and see what they have as far as labeling requirements. Again, going back to the AAFCO standards, what do you have to put on there? Usually, I seem to recall like minimum crude protein is one of the things I remember on pet food containers. How do you establish that? How do you make sure that's true? Because the last thing you want to do is put something out there that turns out to be incorrect, and then you could be dealing with some sort of legal issues. Storage conditions, and this goes to shelf life and then packaging. You might have particular products where they need to be in, let's call it climate controlled environments. And what that means is just basic air conditioning. Doesn't go much under 60, doesn't go much over 90. However, if you're shipping stuff around, and I wouldn't recommend anything that requires refrigerated trucking, but things are going to have temporary times in trucks where things are going to get hot. If you're in an air conditioned warehouse in Texas, 110 happens on a regular basis. If you're in the back of a semi for hours, 110, 120. You'll have to make sure that the products are packaged correctly so they can handle at least short stints of that. You're asking your co-packer what happens when this particular item is stored above 100 degrees for 3 or 4 days, a week, a month. Does it degrade? Does my shelf life go from 18 months to 12 months? These are all questions to ask and have answered, because depending on how quickly you can move your product, you might have an issue where it expires prior to what you think it expires to. All right. I think I saw some critters. Oh, they spotted me. All right, we're back here with Critter Cam. They are hanging out. They spotted me. Now they seem a little bit less worried about me this time. Only 3 of them so far. All right, we got more of them now. That's where they're hanging out. Well, we got a bunch of them here, and we got more along the trail. Well, that one still has spots on them. All right, we got this one up here standing in the path. All right, back to storage conditions. Paying attention to that and how that changes with your packaging. Where is this going to be kept? If you're dealing with Amazon, then you're going to have your co-packer, they're going to make it, and then you have to do something with it. Most co-packers, they won't store your products. It'll either need to go to a 3PL, your own warehouse, or ship it into Amazon. And I would not recommend shipping all your stuff into Amazon. One, because you don't want to have too much product there because they charge a lot for storage fees. And two, if something changes with your product, even something simple like, oh, I forgot to put a label on. If it's at Amazon, that's going to cost you thousands to get it back. And then Amazon sometimes will, if it's something super simple, you could pay Amazon to do it for 60, 100, $1.20 a unit, something like that. But if it's something where Amazon give you a bang on your account because they don't like an ingredient, you need to get that back in your hands, and that can cost you, depending on the size. If it's a big bag of kibble, it's going to be more, but at least $4 a unit to get back in your hands. You send in 5,000 units, that's a lot of cost. Next, production costs. This is something that is definitely a challenge when you're new and you're not used to this. Production costs. This is going to vary depending on where you are in the queue. And what I mean by that is when you're dealing with a co-packer, they have other people that they make product for. You might be able to pay to be earlier in the queue. You might not. What's the size of your production run? The larger the size, the less the per unit cost usually is. If you want them to start up their machines and get running, you have to deal with the cost of the labor for the setup and everything else that goes along with that. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to production runs is setting up a production line can take hours as well as lots of preparation. And oftentimes that's a one-time cost on that run. If you run for 30 minutes or you run for 6 days, the startup is the same cost. So we'll sit down. Let me explain the production run versus production cost. All right, gonna explain production setup versus production run. And I might come up with a separate video just on this, but for right now on the walk and talk, we'll try to keep it relatively simple. If I need to, I'll put some formulas up here that run it through, but we'll just make up a scenario and so we can see how the numbers would work. Okay, we're going to do a run of wet food that's going to be canned. In order to do that, they have to have their raw ingredients. They're going to cook it They're going to blend, cook, possibly blend again, put it in the can, and then do the canning process of the cooking in the can, the final sealing, cooling the item off, drying it off, applying labels, and then packaging it. If I were to set up a production line to do this, number one, I have to have a production line to do this. Your co-packer will have that. They will need to clean the line from the previous run, possibly. Again, this is where sometimes having an off-the-shelf formulation, like the default formulation, let's say that your co you went ahead and went with the default formulation. Well, they might be making this for 3 or 4 different companies. Your setup fee on this would actually be relatively low because the only thing they're changing, the machines are going, they're already cranking, and nothing gets modified. And then at the end, the plain unlabeled silver cans get a new label on them. So they go in a different, they get labeled differently, and then they go in a box and they get a sticker on top. So in that situation, there's really no setup fee. However, if you're dealing with a custom formulation, either one that is a little bit of a tweak or one that is a completely different animal or a completely different product, then your setup is going to change. If it's something to where, again, like say we're using a particular grain, I'll probably have people yelling at me because pet food's not supposed to have corn in it or something. I haven't studied it, so I don't know. But I'm going to use corn because that's what I'm thinking of. Let's say that you want to use corn from Iowa, that because they have a particular non-GMO one that you've sourced, whereas the standard one is regular off the shelf, got it from Purina in bulk. So in that situation, what do? All the other ingredients are the same, the canning process, everything else is the same. So in this particular situation, the co-packer might charge you a small setup fee because they'll actually be running the process, and then you have to also look at, is this a continuous process or a batch process? I would think frequently it's a batch process. So they would finish with the previous one, they take the new one, they need to clean out the hopper where they put the new corn, make sure that's clean to adequate levels. And again, depending on how strict you are with these food changes, it might be something to where, hey, just dump in the new corn's good enough. Or it might be something like you would deal with, not applicable here, but you deal with like in a gluten-free sort of formulation where if there's any trace of the previous ingredient, now you have someone with celiac disease that's complaining because your food isn't actually gluten free. It's mostly gluten free, but you've got some cross contamination. These are all things to pay attention to. Back to to the pet food thing. Let's say that it's not that strict. You just like corn, this other corn better than this other one, and you're going to advertise that. So they need to drain the hopper from the last one. The hopper being the big chute that's filled with the corn flour. They need to drain that out, possibly blow it out, but they don't need to do a wash down or a sanitize or anything like that. Then they put the new dry ingredient in there and then hit the button ready to go. All the other equipment is loaded with the same stuff. So in that particular case, there might be a setup fee. Why? You're stopping production for a period of time. You're draining the old dry ingredient out. You're doing some sort of cleaning process, and it might be minimal. And then you're loading the new one in. You're storing the, let's call it the normal corn somewhere else. And then you've got your own ingredient of the special corn, which is going to take up room in their warehouse to do that. So there may be certain charges for that. Then you run the process through, and then you get your labels and everything like that. So now we're dealing with 2 different levels, and I would say there's a third level. Again, level 1, everything's the same. It's literally what they call a white label, where it's the same stuff in the same process with your label on it instead of someone else's, but the food is exactly the same. There should be minimal to no setup charge for that because nothing changed other than changing a roll of labels. The other one is you have a modified white label formulation where you have 1 or 2 unique ingredients that are a little bit different, but the overall formula hasn't changed. You just again swapped out the corn B instead of corn A, but the percentages, the ratios, the cooking process, all the same. Now you come to a custom one. If you're going to do a custom one, Very frequently, they'll need to shut the lines down. They'll need to clean everything out. And when you're dealing with pet foods or anything that has a raw meat ingredient in it, you're going to have to be, your sanitation processes are going to have to be a bit more stringent. You're going to have to clean out the machines. You're going to have to pull augers out. These are little grindy things that go inside some of these basic pieces of equipment. Swap those out, clean them out. And then in order to switch from generic white label over to custom formulation with a cleaning step, a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours. Well, that is, there's overhead time, there's labor time, there's materials, there's chemicals, there's disposal. All these different things go into swapping over the line to run the batch. Well, let's say that it takes 3 hours for them to clean out the equipment from the previous run, then load up your particular one, make sure that everything is at the right temperatures, because you could have, if you're bringing in meat products, those are usually cold or frozen. Well, if you're processing them, can you process them frozen, or do they need to come up to temperature, or do you need to heat them? Are you doing a cooking process here? Or are you doing a blending process? Then you're doing a cooking process. It gets complex. But it's just something to think about depending on how stringent you are with a custom formulation. This can add to the setup cost. And I don't know what it would be, but let's just say it's $5,000 and it's 3 hours of setup time. And then you have runtime. Once you get all the equipment going, everything up to temperature, everything flowing, and you're kicking out the ingredients, it might take an hour. If they're really good and they're really dialed in and they understand their equipment, it might take 15 minutes. But there's some sort of startup time. There's the setup and then there's the startup. The startup is when you're getting the equipment from off to on to making in spec product. Depending on how good the co-packer is, they get there quickly or they can struggle with it, especially if this is a unique formulation that you're having them do that they've never done before. There may be challenges with, oh, we needed to preheat this ahead of time for this blending process to work. Lots of challenges, and this is part of when they do custom formulations. This is part of the R&D work that they'll do ahead of time. But there's always going to be a challenge when you go from R&D level small batches over to true production sizes, and this is where your MOQs come into play. Most places will have a minimum MOQ, which is minimum order quantity, and that's going to depend on how much hassle it is on how much they're going to run. Now, you can look at it as cost, but in a lot of these cases, it's, again, if you're just doing the straight white label, no changes, they'll usually offer you a relatively low MOQ because they're running this stuff anyway. They're just going to pull aside a pallet's worth of blank cans and they're going to put your label on it. So it didn't make much of a difference. But if you have a custom one where they're shutting down the lines, they're putting in new ingredients, they're getting it up to speed, they're running it. If you have a 3 hour setup, 1 hour startup to get everything in spec, then you're running, they're not going to want to make 10 units, 10 cans, because it just took them 4 hours to get 3 hours plus 1 hour to get an in spec can. They're going to want to produce a fair amount. Depending on the co-packer, those numbers can be bigger or smaller. The bigger they are, the company that is, then the bigger the MOQs tend to be. And the less flexible they also tend to be because they've got big guys in that they're producing stuff for, to where if you don't want half a truck, the half a truck might be their MOQ. And if you're not interested in, if you don't have that because they're used to making people 3, 4, 8 trucks over whatever period of time, and they kind of don't really care for less than a 10 truckload order, you probably want to deal with someone smaller that can handle making a pallet's worth. But your scaling costs, those are going to tend to cost more because they're running in smaller batches and you don't have as many benefits from being able to do these larger runs, where you get more efficient on your run time, and you also buy larger quantities of the raw ingredients, so you get lower prices, all these different things that happen at scale. All right, to continue with that, but that's where you need to look at MOQs, what you're asking for from the co-packer, what they're used to, because there may be places where they're completely fine with doing small runs and they're going to do more R&D work at the same time. And it's just part of also the vetting process when you're talking to co-packers of what's your MOQ, what does your processes look like, what's your startup cost, what's your setup cost, what's your startup cost, what's your run cost. Because what you'll see is you might have a run cost of, well, I'll do a separate video on setup, startup, and production cost, because at the end of the day, you get charged X for however many units you have. And if your startup is huge and then your run is short, you're going to have items that seem like they cost a lot per unit. And that's just because you're dealing with all the costs of setting up a big production line, but then you didn't get any of the benefit of doing a long run on that production line. Okay, next one, supply chain logistics. That's going to be both getting ingredients to the co-packer as well as what you do afterwards. You might have all these different ingredients come from different places, some coming in by rail, some coming in by truck, some coming under refrigerated truck, different things like that. What's the storage capability? If you're bringing in custom refrigerated items that are then going to be processed, does the co-packer have room? How much freezer capacity, refrigerated capacity, climate controlled capacity? How much do they have for all the raw ingredients? And how long do they storage? What are the shelf life of those products? You all have to pay attention to that, because when you get into doing this entire thing, if you have 95% of your ingredients for a run, you can't do your run. And so if you have one special ingredient that's hard to get because it's coming from Madagascar or something, then you need a second source, but you also need a way to just go, okay, if I can't get this in this particular period of time, I've got all this other product, raw ingredients aging. I need to go ahead and do a run to consume the raw ingredients I've already purchased, and they're already sitting at the co-packer. And I just have to accept that I'm either going to wait until I get this other one sourced, or I need to make a run now and I need to pull that ingredient out, possibly do a reformulation so that I'm not out of whatever raw ingredients that I have purchased. And again, working with the co-packer on these different things, this can make it easy because if you have a lot of common ingredients that they already have, then they're sourcing it as well as they'll frequently have a second or third source. And then if you do have supply chain hiccups, it doesn't affect you as much because they are taking on the burden of doing that, but they're not doing it just for you, they're doing it for everybody. But when you have custom ingredients, now it's your responsibility to make sure that you've got all that stuff taken care of as well as a second source, because you're paying for storage of this, and because you're dealing with a food product, it could potentially expire, which means you might, because you have one ingredient that you're really holding out for, you might lose the entire shipment and have to send in a whole new shipment of new stuff and then just dispose of whatever your raw ingredients were before. Again, not a very profitable move, but it happens. Distribution channels. For this particular one, we're going to deal mostly with e-com. And then if you can get into regular retail, then you're looking at, do you go directly to a grocery store buyer? Do you do distributors, KeHE, different folks like that? Right now, it makes sense to do e-com until you get big enough to worry about those other channels. Shipping considerations, nothing super big here or super different because we dealt with all this with packaging. How is this going to be case packed? How is the individual unit going to be packed? How is that going to be case packed? In other words, how many of this particular unit will fit in a box that then fits on a pallet that then goes in somewhere? If you're going with Amazon, very nice thing about Amazon is you can send in as much or as little. I wouldn't say as much. You could send in as little as you want to Amazon. If you wanted to send in 10 units in a UPS box, you can do that. It's not the best thing, but it also means that you don't need to ship in an entire pallet if you don't know how well something's going to sell. It definitely makes more sense for you to hold the bulk of your product at your warehouse or your 3PL. Do your best calculation for what a 60-day run of product will sell. Send in that 60 days into Amazon, then stage stuff back at your 3PL, get it ready, and then look at how well it sells on Amazon. Because again, there's lots of, especially when you're first getting started, you might make some simple mistakes with labeling or weight or something on the product. And once it's in Amazon's hands, you can get it back, but it can take months and it can cost thousands of dollars. So you want to send in, let's call it test quantities to see how everything works. If you have time, you might even send in 30 units, wait until it lands at Amazon, meanwhile keeping your listing off, and then multi-channel fulfill that back to yourself as a test just to see how the e-com packaging is holding up. Inventory management. This kind of goes into a similar thing I was talking about. On Amazon, the cost for storage is pretty expensive. If you turn your inventory quickly, Amazon's not going to charge you much for storage. If you let it sit, they will. Once you get past like 120 days for any particular item, it starts adding up more and more. And your cost for storage fees during Q4 go up regardless of how aged your inventory is. So just having stuff inside Amazon in Q4 is more expensive than it was in all the other quarters. So it's something to think about. What I normally do is once the product is going, and I know that the packaging is good for e-com distribution, then I try to keep between 60 and 75 days inside Amazon based off of sales velocity, and then another 60 days staged and ready at my warehouse so that if I do get a sudden run of sales, so if I do get a sudden run of sales, I can very quickly turn around and get that product into Amazon within like a week. And normally when you start off, you'll probably be shipping in via UPS doing cases as opposed to LTL pallets and things like that. Quality control procedures. This is something to talk with your co-packer on is what procedures are they doing? And again, this is all about food safety and making sure that what they say is going to happen is happening. You're not having any issues with food poisoning or bacterial growth or different things like that. Knowing what their procedures are will help. If you can, I would take a tour of the facility, especially during runtime. Now, some places won't let you, but if you can and they'll let you, go there on a run. Even better, go there on a run of your particular product. And not definitely not all of them will let you do that, but there may be cases where you're talking to ones that are more, let's say, customer centric, you being the customer, where they'll bring you in the R&D part of it so you understand what's going on. When you do that, you can observe what the practices are, you can check for QC. They get the thing running, they pull a sample, they go test it, they've got their own lab for testing. And having your own lab is not necessarily a huge deal. It just means there's a part of the company where the QC goes to be tested, weighed, measured, possibly different bacterial or other kind of pathogen testing is done, as opposed to things being sent out. Because if you can help it, you want a lab that's in house where they can test at the time of running. Certifications needed. This would go back to your AAFCO standard. Are they running under these particular practices and they've got the certifications required for that particular industry? Supplier relationships. That goes back with how many sources do they have, the co-packer, of the raw ingredients so that if there's a hiccup or a big price bump, they can switch to the other one. Definitely important to second or third source all the major, I would say all the ingredients that you're dealing with. The relationship that that particular co-packer has with their suppliers are going to affect your ability to do your next run. Environmental impact, depending on what the process is, who your demographic, psychographic is, there may be certain ways of producing the food that is more or less environmentally impactful. And that's something to talk with the co-packer on what are they doing for these different steps. Now, if they don't really matter to your end consumer, you can skip that step, but it's still something good to know about and check to see what it is, because later on, if it's seen as a positive attribute, you can add that to your marketing. This is a more eco-friendly pet food because we do these particular things. We recycle all this particular waste. We don't dump this over into this other waste stream or whatever it is that they happen to do. Definitely not a deal killer, but something to pay attention to because it may be a positive attribute that you could add in later. Pricing strategy. So this is going to be the pricing strategy for you to get it produced, as well as your pricing strategy for how much you're going to charge. If you're doing e-com, then you've got certain pressures which are different than retail. One of the larger pressures when you're dealing with e-com is going to be the fulfillment cost of the particular of the size of the package, and that can fluctuate significantly depending on what it is. Now, if you're dealing with a wet food, it's going to tend to be a heavy thing that's relatively dense. So we're not dealing with large boxes, we're dealing with small, heavy boxes. Whereas if we're dealing with kibble, we've got a little bit more flexibility on that, where you might be able to pull more of the moisture out and have a lighter bag of ingredients, but it's going to tend to be more bulky. Either of the two cases, something that's super bulky but not super heavy, that can cost more. Something that is not that big but it's very heavy, that can cost more. It's good to do your math ahead of time, figure out what are the dimensions and weight of an individual sellable unit, and what is it going to cost you to get that into the customer's hand, whether you're using Amazon FBA or you're using your own fulfillment and like a Shopify site. And that goes into your pricing. Are you going to price with free shipping? Well, very frequently when you're buying from an e-com site and they offer free shipping, there isn't any free shipping. They're paying for it. They're just putting that into the price of the product. So you might have an item that's $30 with free shipping. Well, that might cost them $7 to ship it to you, whether they're going UPS or USPS or any sort of other shipping option. But you also have to look at what the market will bear as far as cost. Who are you marketing this particular product to? Someone might be able to pay $50 for a 10-pound bag of kibble, and someone else may not want to spend over $20 for a 50-pound bag. Who are you selling it to? How price sensitive are they? And then all these extra factors of your actual cost of goods sold, which went into the production line, all that sort of stuff. And then what's it going to cost to fulfill this, which is the size and considerations of the logistics, and then whether you package your cost to the customer as they buy this plus they pay the fulfillment cost. In other words, it's $29.95 and it's $7 shipping and handling. Then you look at, do you subsidize the shipping? Do you just hand it off to the customer, whatever, put a calculator on your website, whatever that number comes to, they just get it at 100%? Or do you cap it and say all shipping $7? And in some cases it might be 7, in other cases it might be 14, but no matter what, you cap it at 7, and this keeps people from potentially bouncing when they put your stuff in the cart, they go to check out, and they're like, $30, yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. Oh, plus $7.95 shipping and handling. Okay, you've pushed me too far, bail. Definitely something that you have to look at what the customer wants, what do they expect, and what is their behavior as far as paying for the shipping. At the same time, you need to try to minimize that shipping as much as possible. And it might be the shape of the product, how much you put in there. You might even look at different levels where uh, different weights are going to cost a certain amount, or different volumes are going to cost a different amount, and then increase how much you're producing to match whatever that amount is, so that you're getting the maximum quantity shipped at that particular price point. In most places, Amazon's definitely one of them, they will have shipping tiers where every so many ounces or inches or volume, it'll go from this price to the next price to the next price. It's possible to be strategic where you make this a particular weight because it's going to come right under the next tier, but you're not just putting the max in the bag and then letting the chips fall, and wherever they fall, they fall. You're actually strategically putting so much in a bag, strategically making the size of the package something that's going to minimize your fulfillment costs, because then that's going to affect your final pricing. Hello. What you doing? You walked over to me. All right, I'll let you go have the rest of your breakfast. All right, let's see. We talked about the production run. What else on the list? Because we got a huge list, but we're going to try to keep this to things you can calculate and know ahead of time. Okay, there's another thing. Seasonal variability in ingredient availability. Another thing to think about, are there times when this particular product is hard to get, or other things where if there's a drought or too much rain, this particular product becomes harder to get and or more expensive, changing your cost of goods sold. Whereas the end customer, they're probably not gonna, you know, they're not necessarily going to be sensitive that the cost of some ingredient is more for you, and then you raise the price up, even if it's completely justified. It's something to look at. Not a, to me, it's not a huge deal, but it is something to pay attention to. Is just the variability on the ingredients, and there may be times a year where you have to switch from one type of wheat or corn product to a different one because of availability, and the pricing fluctuates. So half the year you might run with this particular set of ingredients, and the other half you might run with a different set of ingredients. Or you might make one run a year and you time it so that it's at the right time, and then you don't have to worry about it. But if you, once you start getting into production, how much did you run? How long's the shelf life? Can you sell through it? Because the worst thing is when you overproduce, then it expires and then you have to dispose of it, because that's just a total waste. You spent the money to make it, now you have to spend money to dispose of it. I think we've run through most of the steps. I didn't want to give every single one of these, but it's something to pay attention to. A lot to do with ingredients, availability, cost, storage of those ingredients, shelf life of those. How much different than what the co-packer is already doing are you having them do? The harder it is, the more it's going to cost. The idea of startup costs, or actually setup costs, startup costs, run costs, and I will do a separate video on that to lay out a handful of different examples. How your packaging is going to affect different things, both with availability, how easy is this to run? If something goes into pouches, what's the difference in the cost of the manufacturing run for this to go in pouches versus to go in a traditional can, either like the Alpo can or like a tuna size can? Does the co-packer have access to these different types of packaging options? You might have one, they do cans, that's all they do. They don't do pouches. And you might have ones that do both. You might have ones that didn't do anything and now they do pouches and they never did cans because they've moved from something else. There's a lot of details, and most of that is asking the co-packer what they do, how much it costs, and how much it costs to change things up. The more you change things, the more they're going to charge you. Now, at the end of the day, if you're making a superior product and the customer is not price sensitive and they really want whatever this is, you can justify this. But you also have to deal with a co-packer who's willing to do this, because you can find people to where they'll charge you more money for stuff, and then you can have other ones that go, I don't want to do it even if you pay me more, because they know they've got their products that they're already running mass quantities of that keep the lights on, and they don't necessarily want to turn those off to go for yours, even if they charge you more for it. When it comes to the pet food situation, I would definitely say the research is talking with as many co-packers as possible, both on dry, wet. Normally, a place that does wet, and a place that does dry. And a lot of places don't do both because the processes are very different between the two. If you're looking to do a mix of wet and dry as your product set, you're going to be dealing with different people. However, you might have a dry place and they might actually be able to recommend a wet place because they don't necessarily see them as competition, because it's so very different. Your own research, talking to veterinary dietitians is another thing to look at. So you are going to have to become educated in the language that they use and all these different processes to make sure that you're making a good product and you can keep on running your business going into the future, because it's very easy to do a single run. You didn't pay attention to some sort of detail, and then now you got to change the formula, or you didn't test it ahead of time for being palatable to the target animal, and now you've got something that no one wants. Might be awesome from a nutritional basis, but if they won't eat it, it won't matter. So these are all different steps that you can be done. And it's also possible, especially if you're dealing with a co-packer on the R&D cycle, they can do tests of your formulations and you get that done. Now this starts to get expensive because you're running through these different processes. So it's something to think about, but it's also something you might be able to do by recruiting your own people, having your own backing, like on Facebook or Instagram or wherever, and have your own fan base. And you can let people know, it's like, hey, I'll give you free samples. And this is something that you'd get from the R&D cycle at the co-packer. And you send that out to the customers and ask them, how well did it work? It's kind of an informal study instead of a formal study where you pay for, I guess it would be the equivalent of like a focus group. All right. Well, I think that about covers the basic run through. If this sort of idea is valuable, let me know. Comment below if you want me to do different run throughs like this for other sort of product sets. Add them down into the comments. I'm thinking about we did pet food this time, but it could be for cookies, baked products, jerky, laundry detergent could be another one. We cover that a little bit, different things like that. So there's lots of different product sets and what you have to think about and the different parts to the business that get you from your idea to the customer buying your product to you being profitable. The macro steps are very similar, but some of the individual micro things are going to be unique for whatever the product set is. Again, any other requests, go ahead and post it below. And great talking with y'all again.